this morning to discuss the three joint resolutions of disapproval, or JRDs, that the Senate will be voting on tomorrow. They are SJ Res 111 to block 120 millimeter tank rounds, SJ Res 113 to block 120 millimeter high explosive mortar rounds, SJ Res 115 to block JDAMs, which are guidance kits attached to many of the bombs dropped in Gaza. The truth of the matter is that from a legal perspective, these resolutions are not complicated. They're cut and dry. The United States government is currently in violation of the law, and every member of the U.S. Senate who believes in the rule of law should vote for these resolutions. The Foreign Assistance Act and the Arms Export Control Act are very clear. The United States cannot provide weaponry to countries that violate internationally recognized human rights or block U.S. humanitarian aid. According to the United Nations, much of the international community and every humanitarian organization on the ground in Gaza, Israel is clearly in violation of these laws. Under these circumstances, it is illegal for the U.S. government to provide them with more offensive weaponry. Joint resolutions of disapproval are Congress's tool to enforce those laws. As I have said many times, Israel clearly had a right to respond to the horrific Hamas terrorist attacks on October 7th, which killed some 1,200 innocent people and took 250 hostages. I don't think anybody in the U.S. Senate disagrees with that. But Prime Minister Netanyahu's extremist government has not simply waged war against Hamas. It has waged all-out war against the Palestinian people. Within Gaza's population of just 2.2 million inhabitants, more than 43,000 have been killed and more than 103,000 injured, 60% of whom are women, children, and elderly people. 2/3 of all structures in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. That includes 87% of the housing. 87% of the housing, 84% of health facilities, and 70% of water and sanitation plants. Every one of Gaza's 12 universities has been bombed, as have hundreds of schools. For 13 months, there has been no electricity in Gaza. And that's what has gone on over the last year. And as horrific as that situation is, what is taking place today, now, as we speak, is even worse. As a result of Israel blocking desperately needed humanitarian aid in recent weeks, the volume of aid getting into Gaza is lower than at any point since the war began. More aid is needed, less aid is getting through. The result, and let's be very clear about this, the result is that many, many thousands of children are facing malnutrition and starvation. According to very recent UN reports, quote, the situation unfolding in North Gaza is apocalyptic. The entire population in North Gaza is at imminent risk of dying from disease, famine, and violence, end of quote. And Israel's recent decision to ban UNRWA, the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza, will only make a horrific situation even worse. Clearly, what is happening in Gaza today is unspeakable. But what makes it even more painful is that much of what is happening there has been done with U.S. weapons and with American taxpayer support. In the last year alone, the U.S. has provided $18 billion in military aid to Israel and delivered more than 50,000 tons of military equipment. In other words, and this is the most important point to be made, the United States of America is complicit in these atrocities. That complicity must end, and that is what these resolutions are about. It is time to tell the Netanyahu government that they cannot use U.S. taxpayer dollars and American weapons in violation of U.S. and international law and in violation of our moral values. It is also time to make clear to Netanyahu that he cannot continue to undermine U.S. foreign policy goals. The U.S. government wants a ceasefire for hostage deal. Netanyahu has prevented a deal to preserve his coalition. The U.S. government wants more humanitarian aid to reach desperate people in Gaza. Netanyahu is blocking it. The U.S. government wants to contain regional escalation. Netanyahu has refused diplomatic off-ramps and launched several reckless attacks without consulting the United States. The U.S. government wants to stop settlement expansion and settler violence in the West Bank. Netanyahu and his ministers have driven record settlement expansion and armed extremist settlers. The U.S. government wants a plan for post-war governance in Gaza. Netanyahu will not engage. And by the way, blocking these sales would also be in keeping with actions taken by some of our closest allies. The UK suspended 30 arms export licenses after concluding there was an unspeakable risk that they could be used in violation of international law. Germany, Italy, Spain, Canada, Belgium, and the Netherlands have taken similar steps. UN bodies have called for an end to the arms shipment fueling the conflict.
Really appreciate the work you've done on this. You know, there's a question that America has to face, and it is about the role of humanitarian considerations in the conduct of our foreign policy. The argument is being made against injecting what clearly is a concern for the humanitarian catastrophe that is now continuing in Gaza, as to whether the long-term commitment that the United States has had to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state can coexist with that. All of us here support Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. All of us here believe in the two-state solution. All of us believe that the relationship we've had with Israel is special. And all of us here are appalled at what Hamas did to slaughter 1,200 innocent Israelis. And all of us here support the right of Israel to defend itself. But what has unfolded in the name of that defense is the loss of 43,000 and rising Palestinians, many of whom are women and children and non-combatants, not at all connected to Hamas. What has happened is over 100,000 children and innocent bystanders have been severely injured, including amputation. And what's unfolding before our very eyes right now is mass starvation and the spread of disease. Is the United States in its foreign policy, with that commitment we've had to Israel, forced to be blind to the suffering before our very eyes, particularly when it's our munitions that are being used? Should we be blind to the suffering of those Palestinian women and children when top military officials in Israel themselves have said that there's no further military purpose for continued bombing and military activity in Gaza? Our view is no, that the humanitarian considerations are important. It's consistent with the Leahy Law, and we should enforce it. It's consistent with humanitarian international law, where the power that is occupying or in control has an obligation to facilitate, not impede, the delivery of life-saving aid. So I stand here as a person who believes that there's no inconsistency with the United States asserting conditions on aid that are consistent with our commitment to our own policies, a two-state solution. the enforcement of the Leahy Law, the enforcement of international law. You know, when I think about the conflict that the United States had with Russia for so long, the Soviet Union, there are many historians who think one of the most significant components of what made us so successful was our civil rights movement. The commitment that was on display to the people around the world of our struggle to try to broaden the reach of civil rights for every person. Isn't that the same situation we face, where we have before us every single day evidence of more suffering of women and children in a situation where there's no military purpose to be served by the continuation of using our weapons, and where it's in total conflict with us having any chance of achieving a two-state solution, and where the result of this activity is escalation in Lebanon, escalation even in Syria, in the rising violence in the West Bank, and where politicians in Israel, including Netanyahu and many others who support him, are talking about annexing the West Bank and completely and utterly turning their back on a two-state solution. This is very important for Congress to act. And it's an action that's consistent with the long-term commitment we've had to Israel's security, and it's a commitment that should be a long-term commitment we have to the inclusion of humanitarian considerations in our foreign policy. Thank you.